Hi, everyone. Gene here. Before we jump into today's show, two quick notes. First of all, if you haven't checked out episode 293, where I share with you 5 things that you can do to improve your outcome with tapping, you should check that out right away. All you need to do is go to tappingqandapodcast.com, click on the link for episode 293, information that you can use and implement right away. Lots of folks have written me saying it is useful. You should check it out. The second thing is today's conversation with my buddy Gregg. We talk about calling and how you find your way to where you're supposed to be in life and how inspiration plays a part in that. At the end of the interview, we talk about how you can use EFT to actually implement what we talk about. So conversation first, then I have some tapping at the end and some insight on how we can use EFT to more effectively find and follow our calling. Enjoy today's show.
From what I see from my vantage point, is the primary drama in people's relationship to their own sense of vitality is this constant struggle between security, comfort, familiarity, and risk, and adventure, and the unknown.
Hi, this is Gene Monterastelli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 296, originally aired December 6th, 2017. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we have a conversation about calling, how we find our way to calling, and some simple tapping things that you can do right away to be able to more clearly understand what your calling is and clear space to take action to move you towards that. Before we jump into that, one quick announcement. As you have noticed over the last couple of episodes, and I think we almost have all of the changes implemented in this episode, I've been able to make some upgrades to the way that I record the podcast to make them easier to listen to improve the quality. That happens because of listeners just like you support the podcast. If you would like to support the podcast and get some amazing thank you gifts, all you need to do is go to tappingqna.com/support, or if you are listening to this inside of some sort of smartphone or tablet, if you go to the show notes, there's a link that says support the podcast. If you click on that, you can help improve the show. Once we get to the next milestone, we're going to start transcribing all of the interviews. So not only can you listen to them, if you want to, you can go back and read them because some people digest the information in a different way when it's read. Today, I have a conversation with Gregg Levoy. Gregg is such a great guest because he's just so thoughtful and interesting and has so much information that he can draw from. As you'll hear over the course of this interview, he's pulling quotes and books that he's read and just seamlessly integrates it, not in a showy way, but in a way that really heightens the conversation. The conversation itself is about calling. Gregg recently wrote a book on that and how we can access our own calling as we move forward. So here is my conversation with Gregg about calling and how we find our way to ours. So for you, what is the definition of calling?
Yeah, well, I have a very pluralistic, secular definition, and that is these are the signs, the signals, the urgings, the promptings, the sometimes, of course, imperatives that come from deep inside people's lives that essentially guide them, tell them what it's going to take to stay true to true north, really. And they come in a very impressive variety of forms. So I'm always encouraging people to turn on all these various receivers. To the degree you actually want to hear your marching orders. Not everybody does.
Right.
But turn them on, and because calls come through things like dreams and body symptoms and song lyrics you can't get out of your head for weeks, and a decision that needs to be made in your life now rather than backburnered for another year, that's a call. An intuition is a call. Wherever there's friction in your life, it's like in the natural world. It's where changes are trying to take place. So there's calls embedded in where does head argue with heart all the time, or walk doesn't really match talk, or passion kind of rubs up against security. There's callings in those kind of places. So that's kind of how I'm defining it. And the level at which I'm encouraging people to look at this stuff is really the subtleties, not the big burning bushes.
Yeah, and so inside of all of that, you talked about lots of different ways that we can hear call, but what was absent from that, which I'd be really curious to hear what your answer would be, what is it a calling to? Is it a calling to what I'm going to have for lunch, or is it this is what I'm giving the rest of my life to? Like when we get that sense of inspiration to ponder something and wrestle with it and see where that, as you said, that true north is, what is it pushing us towards, or what is it calling us towards?
It's funny you should actually use that example of the, what kind of sandwich do I want for lunch? Because at some level, in a sense, that is actually a little call. That's why I included the word intuitions in there. Because I want to encourage people to look at the little small urgings, the little crossroads you come to a half a dozen times in the course of a given day. One of them takes you toward, one of them takes you away from what you really want to be doing. So actually intuiting, what do I really feel like eating for lunch, or what do I really feel like saying in this conversation, or which of these two books do I really feel like taking home from the library? Those are actually fire drills for the bigger ones, and which I think gets at your question, which is what calls are calling us toward is, I think, authenticity and integrity. Not in a moral sense, but a psychological sense, as in being in integrity with who we really are. And I think ultimately calls also call us to service. I think in most cases that's ultimately what the larger calls are really about, in the sense of what kind of work should I do in the world? What are my true gifts? What are my contributions? What is my legacy? These are kind of service questions, and I think that's what calls are calling us toward is whatever's greater than ourselves. I spent a little bit of time over in Morocco some years ago. It was the first time I'd ever been in a Muslim country, and 5 times a day, the chanters up on top of the minarets call people away from whatever the daily grind is, whether it's, hammering copper pots or tending to the mules or whatever, and you're supposed to stop whatever you're doing, turn toward Mecca, and pray. So in a sense, those are calls, one of the original forms of calls. And the point was, stop whatever you're doing in the kind of the mortal world and turn toward the divine. Literally turn and face the divine. So whatever that means to an individual, what is sacred in your life? How do you connect with what is greater than yourself? That could be the divine in the form of gods or goddesses, but it could also be the community is larger than yourself, and the natural world, your own potential. And frankly, this is my working definition of spirituality anyway, just for myself, is the work of creating a bond with whatever's bigger than me. I think that's what calls are pointing us toward.
So in the beginning, you gave this example of all of these places that calls show up. And then I really like the example of having the day punctured in that really specific way. I guess the place that I struggle, and maybe you could shine some insight on how you manage this, is at one end of the spectrum, I have my head down and I'm doing what I'm doing. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm taking every single piece of experience and data and emotion and physical sensation, and I'm like, this is inspiration and I must be responding to this. And if I'm in a situation where I just turn into a puppy dog that's chasing after every shiny object and is not focused on anything for a moment. How do we navigate then the kind of being open, receptive, and still being people in the world who are responding to that, and we're not just spending all of our time listening to it?
That's a good question, complex question. Well, this is what comes to me just shooting from the hip. I'm a really big believer in having a dialoguing practice of some kind in your life. And most of the people that I interviewed, say, for the Callings book, talked about having some kind of self-reflective practice. And the whole point of it seemed to be striking up a conversation with the part of you that kind of orchestrates calls. Some people call it soul, some people call it spirit, or the unconscious, or whatever. But I think there's something about having a self-reflective practice that continually keeps me in touch with some of the deeper strata, some of just the deeper urgencies in my life, so that I'm not just, chasing after shiny objects, but I'm continually tapped into deeper conversations and larger voices that want to speak through me. Again, call it what you will. But there's something about these practices. For instance, dream interpretation I do on a regular, pretty much a daily basis. I mean, for some people, that's a self-reflective practice. Whatever the practice is, I think there's something about that keeps me and keeps people connected to a deeper well, so that we're, in a sense, we've got one foot in the inner world and one in the outer, where the work's got to be done, the pick and shovel work of just day-to-day life. There's one in the one foot in the material world and one in the sacred, if you will. One devoted to the tasks of competence and practicality, and one devoted to the tasks of authenticity. So I think there's something about keeping a lifeline into that realm in whatever way works for you that's kind of really grounding and allows you to kind of navigate the mortal world a little more gracefully.
And as you talk about that, I think of like an image I use a lot in my own life and thinking about things like this is a pendulum that's swinging. And at one end of the swing is very practical. At the other end of the world is that very internal seeking. And it's seasonal. That there are seasons of my life where I'm significantly more practical, and there's seasons of my life where I'm significantly more introspective.
Right.
And I guess my goal and my hope is the pendulum's never going to stop swinging, but the closer I can keep it to that middle place where it's an equal balance of the two, the more likely it is going to be big picture wise in the long term over the arc of my life that I'm going to be responding to that in a more effective way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautifully put. The actual object that I've associated with is probably similar to yours. It's not the pendulum, it's the what do they call it? It's a compass that you use in mechanical drawing class.
Yep. Yeah.
Where there's one tine is stationary and the other gets to swing out.
Yep. Yeah, and the distance can change as we decide how big or small that circle needs to be.
But your comment does point to an interesting idea, which is there is a sine wave involved in a life of call and response. There's a developmental arc, if nothing else. The calls change over the course of life. They don't stay the same. Even if you're like me, you're in the same work you've been doing for 40 years, which is being a writer. The forms of it change. The subject matter changes. Employed sometimes, self-employed other times. Local stories versus international stories. There are lots of different arcs in the course of any given life of callings. And this is one of the reasons why it pays to have the receivers turned on and have this self-dialoguing practice, because they change. No, because you change. And so will the calls that come through the being that's being called. And I just think it, in terms of staying in integrity with yourself, you've really got to be willing to go with that flow. Like you said, the pendulum, it swings one way and it swings another, and I think it's important to keep that in mind.
And I think it's really important what you identified there in this idea that who we are and how we are in the world changes over the course of our life. That I think sometimes in this pursuit of, this is my calling, it's this thing I'm supposed to do. And I can remember, I could remember in my early 20s, I was part of a national organization that was connected to some service work. And we had a big national meeting every single year, and it was one of my favorite things. And after 4 years, my buddy Mike didn't show up because he had moved on to something else. And I didn't know that until we got to the meeting, and when I was asking about him, because I hadn't chatted with him in a while. And I was just like devastated and couldn't believe someone would move on from this. And 15 years later, I was at the exact same meeting, and I still go, and it's still something that is a part of my life. But Mike came back into my head, and I'm like, oh yeah, I could totally see how someone would move on from this. Like at that season in my life, it was so rooted, I couldn't see beyond it. And, a decade and a half later, I was such a radically different person. And the landscape in which the organization was doing work changed because the world had changed in 15 years. And so it made sense. It was like, oh yeah, this thing that felt so central to who I was in my identity that was never going to end because it's who I am. I realized it wasn't. And being open and recognizing the fact that there's a seasonal sense to some of these even bigger arcs in our life.
Absolutely. And therefore, the need to practice, non-attachment or surrender or relinquishment, or whatever you want to call it. Because sometimes calls call us out of the box we've been in, out of the comfort zone, out of whatever the status quo is, or a sense of identity or status or any of that. And in order to honor the kind of the on-movingness of life, you sometimes just have to let go of stuff you're really attached to.
Right.
And that's one of the sort of the scary parts of callings, is they do call you away from the status quo. Not just 5 times a day you get to go back to hammering pots, but sometimes it's like, no, I got to quit this job, or I've got to leave this toxic marriage, or I've got to stop being such a lone wolf and start cultivating community. And, you've got to let go of who you've been for who you need to become. And that's good, hard human work sometimes. I've been there many times.
Well, and it's one of those things that I bump into all the time when I'm working with my clients, taking any sort of action, not even something that's necessarily big like we're talking about here. And the crap we know is better than the crap we don't know, because what I know in this moment is predictable. It might be painful. It might be incomplete, but I know all of the rules of engagement of this, and I know how to survive this. This new thing might be better. It might be fun. It might be dynamic, but it's so unknown that I don't know what that is, and it could be much worse than this. So there's this part of me that just wants to be anchored into the place that I'm stuck so that I am, quote unquote, safe.
See, that to me seems like, from what I see from my vantage point, it is the primary drama in people's relationship to their own sense of, vitality, is this constant struggle between security, comfort, familiarity, and risk and adventure and the unknown. Mm-hmm. And it's a constant dialectic, back and forth. And negotiating it is tough. And my observation, as well as my personal experience, is that in the tug of war between those two forces, let's call it, passion and security tends to win.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, we are hardwired for safety. Like that is our genetic heritage, is for us to be safe.
Right. And so that's why I refer to it as a tug of war, because yes, part of us wants safety and security and familiarity, and the brain is wired to turn novelty into habit really fast. But then there's the other part of us that wants growth and spontaneity and adventure and novelty and discovery. And people who study this stuff seem to think that people who tend to thrive the most over the course of their lives tend to score pretty high in novelty seeking. And that goes against the genetic testing, at least for most people. I would imagine that anthropologically speaking, there's always a couple of people in any tribe who are the ones who are willing to look around the corner and go a little farther afield and step away from the village and the campfire. And I think those are people are critical to any culture in terms of the growth of the culture. But I don't think most people are wired that way. And so it takes pushing ourselves out of the nest deliberately to have a life that flourishes and thrives and grows and has novelty to it.
Intellectually, I see myself making a statement of this is what I really feel I need to be doing. And practically I'm not. Then that becomes a really good question to ask around that resistance. Like, what is the fear here? Is it a fear about something specific that I'm stepping into, or is it the fear of leaving the comfort of where I am?
Right, exactly.
So I want to take a look at the flip side of this, where it's like almost like the opposite of the resistance. It's the kind of over-functioning in the reception of the information that we're receiving. I know I have friends and clients who will say, I really feel like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I will ask why. And they say, well, I had this dream or I had this sensation. And I'm like, well, that's one possible interpretation of what's just happening there. How do we then, because all of the examples you gave, it's not a plane pulling a sign through the sky telling me what I'm supposed to be doing. Like, these are subtler inclinations. How do we figure out if we are accurately interpreting this information that is coming forward as we try and navigate this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I do a lot of dream work, I'm aware of the tendency to want to jump to a conclusion or make an assumption about what an image means, and it's not necessarily that easy. Well, for one thing, I think you got to give it time. Mm-hmm. You got to give yourself 6 months and collect signs and signals, and then connect the dots and see what you've got, rather than just jumping to conclusions about what something means and what you're supposed to do. Just because I think discernment is a kind of a sticky, tricky art, and doesn't necessarily, it's not like the famous Gordian knot. You're not just going to slice through it with a sword. Sometimes you just got to pick at it for months until it really gets clear.
Right.
So I think just patience sometimes is the better part of valor in terms of discerning what the information you're gathering actually means and what you're supposed to do about it and when. But this is something I ask everybody that I've ever interviewed about this is, how did you figure this out? I mean, of all the multitudes of possible paths and calls that you can take in life, how did you know that this was the right one for you?
Right.
I mean, my God, the responses are really, frankly, so predictable, Gene, that I can just list it for you. People have said to me that they knew a call was true. For one thing, it kept coming back again and again. That was a really common one. Over a period of time, it just never went away. And even when they tried to forget about it, it came through their dreams or something like that. Another way that people knew was that they got the information from a lot of different directions. It wasn't just like one sign isolated by itself, but you're getting it through dreams and body symptoms and the section of the bookstore you always walk into when you go into a bookstore, and the fantasies that you have and the books that end up on your night table, and there's a clustering effect, I guess, and you got to connect the dots. People said they knew that the choice was right for them because it drew a lot of passion and energy out of them. Mm-hmm. That was one. Another one was it scared the hell out of them sometimes.
Right.
That was interesting how often, not very often, but how often I heard a remark like, I don't know, I figure if its path feels safe and easy, it's kind of suspect, but if it scares the daylights out of me, it means I'm close to something vital. Yeah,
a friend of mine has started selling T-shirts that says "Scary means do it."
Oh, that's great. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, obviously, in a purely biological sense, that wouldn't necessarily go across the board. Of course,
yeah.
If you're scared of heights, you don't want to jump over a cliff. But yeah, I think in most cases for people, that's really true. There's something in the fear that's vital to us, and we're scared of it because there's something at stake. And, everybody said some version of, I don't know, I did it because it just felt right.
Yeah.
I couldn't necessarily explain it, but I couldn't deny it either. It just feels right at some really core level.
So what happens then if we don't respond? Like, what's the consequence for either consciously saying no or unconsciously filling our life with so much crappity crap that we don't have to deal with it? Like, what's the consequence for that?
Oh, wake-up calls, in a word.
Mm-hmm.
This is just my own experience as well as the people that I've, spoken to about their calls, is, for better or for worse, they're not going anywhere.
Uh-huh.
You can run to the far ends of the earth, but, like they say, wherever you go, there you are.
Right.
So they don't go away. It's like the search party isn't going to retire. And this is a blessing and a curse for most people, I think, because if you don't respond to the calls, to the gifts that you were given, or the passions that need to be acted on, or even just your value system, I think it's going to turn into suffering. It's going to turn into a feeling of being out of whack with yourself, or physical symptoms sometimes. Here's a question that I actually ask people in my workshops. Because of a remark a psychologist made to me once. He said, symptoms are usually dreams trying to come true. I know, which is a really provocative idea.
Yeah.
But I tried this out. I say, okay, I'm not even asking you to believe that, but take a shot at this. First part of the question, two parts. First part is write down some recurring symptom in your body, just anything that's got your attention. And the second part is give that symptom a voice and let it fill in the blank. This would be the symptom speaking to you saying, my dream is that you would, and fill in the blank.
Wow, that's great.
And man alive, the stuff that comes out of that question alone is so riveting. I don't know what a panel of doctors would say about a conversation like that, and frankly, I don't care. The fact that people believe there's a connection between a physical symptom and a psychological symptom is fascinating. That will often happen is the refusal of your voice or your power or your sense of purpose is going to turn on you. And one of the ways it often does it is through the body, which is why I have a whole chapter in the Callings book called The Language of the Body, because the word itself, the word symptom, etymologically means a sign.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it's pointing to something else. That's why we call it a symptom.
Exactly. And what is it pointing to? The word pathology, same thing. It means the logic of pain. Well, what's the logic? If you were to apply some logic, even if it's psychologic, what is it? And that changes the whole conversation around symptoms in my book. It's not like you're just going to slap some medication on it, but you're going to go below the surface to what may be going on there. Granted, there are symptoms that, you get bitten by an Anopheles mosquito, you're going to get malaria probably. I'm not saying that there aren't, stuff doesn't just hit the fan. But in many cases, symptoms mean signs. And that's something that happens when we refuse calls. And maybe just an emotional symptom, like envy at other people's successes. Or I just did a consultation 2 days ago with a woman who said that whenever she was around therapists, she felt herself getting angry and envious. And then she finally realized she wanted to be doing that. So there's psychologic.
Yeah. My friend Catherine always says the universe first throws feathers and then it throws elephants.
Yeah, that's so true. I couldn't agree with her more. I think calls start off as, sort of polite whispers and taps on the shoulder. There's the feathers. But they escalate to shoving and shouting the more we ignore it.
Yeah.
That's definitely something I've seen in my life and other people's. I don't mean that to scare people, like, you better get on it,
right,
or else. But there are consequences for refusing personal power and creativity and, what was that wonderful phrase from Auden? Your foiled creative fire.
Right.
There's, it's like the human psyche is like the earth. It's a closed system. I mean, in the sense that there's no away, as in running away. There's no out, as in throwing the garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? There's no up here. There's no trash icon. You can't just delete stuff. It goes in there somewhere, and if you don't act on it, it's going to find a way out somehow. It's just really basically systems theory. Like John Muir said, everything's hitched to everything else. You're not going to push your power down and just expect it to just lie there and behave itself. It's going to come out, and it isn't necessarily going to be pretty.
Right.
I heard a Mexican poet years ago named Jose Frias once say, I tried to drown my sorrows with drink, but the damn things learned how to swim.
That's delightful. Theory. Yeah. Huh. So, with that being said, and someone's kind of waded through this conversation with us, practical first step. Someone who's heard this, who says, okay, I want to be more aware, I want to be more present. Where's the place they start?
I would say a self-reflective practice of some kind. Mm-hmm. Turn the machine on and, be willing to hear what you hear. I mean, I get it when I say that that's not just flicking a switch.
Right.
It's saying yes to things that maybe you said no to for maybe half your life. But start a self-reflective practice. Do some daily journaling. Do some dream work. Join with a group whose members get together to talk at depth about stuff.
Yeah.
Something like that is a start. I would say don't isolate would be another starting point. If you're anything like me, you're a little too rugged and individualist for your own good. I would say join with other people who are on the path. I remember a poet, Rita Dove, once said, Nikki Giovanni said, do not surround yourself with people who don't have dreams.
Yeah.
And it's like that. It's find ways of sharing the challenges of listening and clarifying and responding to calls with a group of like-minded people. Like I used to have a personal board of advisors. And I also belonged to somebody else's at one point. And this is just Barbara Scher calls them dream teams. And this is a bunch of people you pull together from your circle of acquaintances, and you strike a deal. You say, I need help in responding to a call. Maybe it's to quit my job. Maybe it's to start my own business. Maybe it's just to start being creative again after 20 years of not. I want help. So I'm asking 8 people to be on my board of advisors for 6 months. We're going to meet only once a month. First order of business, I'm going to feed you guys. And then we're going to retire to my dining room table for 2.5 hours, and your job as my board members will be 3 things. You need to give me feedback, and you need to ask me questions, and you need to give me homework. So I'm accountable to you guys the next time we meet. So, creating something in your life like that, where you're building accountability into the proceedings for yourself. Because once you start doing that, people are going to, of course, ask you about the campaign, and it's a good way to keep yourself on track.
That's awesome. Very good. Well, Gregg, thank you very much for your time. I always appreciate our conversations.
Yeah, me too. I love your questions.
So I hope you found that interview as useful and interesting as I did. Like I said at the beginning of the show, now we're going to spend a little time tapping on a few things that I think will be really helpful in moving forward. Because simply having the disposition of wanting to hear our calling is a good thing, but we can get in our way because it can be scary. It can even feel dangerous on a subconscious level to pursue who we're truly called to be. So I have 4 short tappings that I think will be useful for you. So we're just going to go through them right now. After the fact, you might want to come back to these, so bookmark today's show. So the first tapping is around this idea of being open to inspiration and putting ourselves in that position. So take a nice big deep breath for me. And just move from tapping point to tapping point in the way that makes the most sense to you. I give myself permission to be open to inspiration, to hear calling in big and small ways. And I give myself permission to hear this calling in ways that are unexpected, in ways that are even wacky, because I know I have access to the information to lead myself by the right path. This does not mean I expect the next 75 years of my life to show up with clear instruction in the next 4.5 minutes. I know that this inspiration will come in many forms. Sometimes obvious, and sometimes subtle. But I give my system permission to know that it is okay for me to feel a little overwhelmed, to feel uncertain, but knowing that inspiration can come, inspiration will come, and I give myself permission to respond to it. Nice deep breath. The second thing that we're going to tap on is an idea that I found really true in my own life. Oftentimes, inspiration doesn't necessarily come in the form of answers, but it comes in the form of the question I should ask next. And that question be, should I pursue this? Should I try this? Should I investigate this? And in that investigation, even though the thing I am not investigating is the thing that I ultimately end up doing, it puts me heading in the right direction. So again, tap on the side of the hand, take a nice big deep breath. And just move from tapping point to tapping point, repeating after me. I am open to having answers. I am open to having clear information. But I recognize the fact sometimes my calling is going to show up as questions. And it's not going to show up as clear answers. And as much as I would like to have clear answers, it is okay if I get questions. Because I know in working with inspired questions, I am going to find my way to unexpected answers. Sometimes inspiration is a process. It's not necessarily a straight line. And I give myself permission to be open to the process, to be open to receiving questions, to being open to exploring questions without answers, knowing full well that these questions can lead me on a useful path. The third tappable issue, at least for me when it comes to wrestling with this idea of calling, is around this idea of feeling like I need to figure it out for the long haul. And sometimes our inspiration and our calling is short-term, and it isn't necessarily forever. Tippy top of the head, and just go from tapping point to tapping point, repeating after me. When I receive information, when I receive inspiration, when I am in touch with my calling, I recognize the fact that this isn't necessarily my calling for the rest of my life. This isn't who I'm supposed to be forever. This isn't what I'm supposed to do forever. Instead, it is information for today. Information that's going to help me to craft tomorrow. Information that's going to move me forward in the near term. It is possible I could be called to this for the rest of my life. And it is possible that this is much more short term. I give myself permission to trust myself. And to trust the process. Engaging with my inspiration, knowing I will soon be inspired again. Nice deep breath. The last thing I think it's important to do is recognize the fact that as we have insight, it's really easy to beat ourselves up because we didn't have that insight sooner. And so just tap with me. Nice big deep breath. When I encounter insight, when I encounter clarity, when I'm in touch with what I should do and who I should be, it can feel obvious. Because it strikes such a deep chord with who I am. It strikes such a deep chord in how I want to be. And when this happens, it's really easy to beat myself up. For not discovering this sooner. For not being open sooner. For not being ready sooner. But I recognize the fact that this is all part of the process. It might be obvious now, but it took what came before for it to be obvious now. I give myself permission to be easy with myself. For beating myself up. For not figuring it out sooner. The only thing that matters in this moment is what I choose to do in this moment in response to this inspiration. I forgive myself for not figuring this out sooner. I give myself permission for being gentle with myself, for not getting here faster. I trust this process. And now is the right time for me to be here. I choose to be in this moment and not look back. I choose to create the next moment and not look back. Now is the right time. Nice big deep breath. I hope you found those tap-alongs useful, and I really hope you enjoyed the conversation that I had with Gregg. Like I said, he's just such a thoughtful dude. For more information on Gregg, all you need to do is go to tappingqandapodcast.com, click on the link for episode 296, or if you happen to be listening to this inside of the app, or if you're listening to it in some sort of iPhone or iPad, simply go to the show notes. We have all of Gregg's contact information as well as his new book on calling, moving forward, and following inspiration, which is a great read, and you should check it out. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast. You can do that in Apple Podcasts and Google Music Play, in Stitcher, in TuneIn, and now you can even find us in Spotify. You can only find the show on the mobile app, so if you have Spotify on a tablet or a phone, you can find it there. You can't find it on your desktop version yet. Just search Tapping Q&A and you will be able to find it. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you'd like to hear some topic covered in the future, I love hearing from recommendations from people like you. You can always drop me a note, Gene, Gene, at tappingqanda.com. Inside the app, you can click on the contact link. If you're on the website, click on the contact link. On the menu, you can leave me a voice message, or you can type me a message either from the website or inside of the app. If you know someone who could benefit from today's conversation, please be our ambassador. Pass this on. You don't have to spam your inbox and send it to every person in the world, but you might know someone who finds this really useful, and it would mean the world to me if you pass that along. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Monterastelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Monterastelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Monterastelli or Tapping Q&A.